Thank you. Thank you so very much to Bridget and to all of those folks who were kind enough to bring me here and ask me to help out with this. Um, Before I get started, I do want to say this. This is not my first trip to Kauai. It's not my last trip to Kauai. Um, it's not my first trip to the Hawaiian Islands. I was giving a speech not long ago on the Big Island about this subject, in fact. Um, my sister would like for me to tell you that she's a graduate of Honolulu High School class of 1952. Do we have any 50s in here? 52? Here we go. Not here. Um, but this is a special and wonderful place of all of the places in the world to which I get the pleasure of going. And fortunate or unfortunate as the case may be, I am personally keeping Delta Airlines in business. I get to travel around the globe and meet wonderful people. But this island is one of the most special places that I've ever seen. I've driven all around the island. Saturday morning, I'm going to take some time and fly over the island. I'm amazed at the beauty, but I'm also amazed at the culture, the history, the sense of who you are about this island, the sense of traditions, the spirit with which so many people feel for this island. I pray that I am respectful of those traditions and respectful of that culture while I'm here. And so I appreciate the opportunity to enjoy this beautiful park that you have. My name is John Kilpatrick. I'm the CEO of a company called Greenfield Advisors. We're headquartered in Seattle. We also have offices in Atlanta, in Key West, Florida. We're getting ready to open one in D.C. We're negotiating to open one in Canada. We're a 40-year-old real estate consulting company. We've done it all. We are best known for working on very complex real estate problems, and specifically on working on contaminated or damaged real estate. That's not all we do, and in fact, that's not the majority of what we do, but it is one thing that we're very, very well known for doing. We employ a lot of people. So with all those people on the payroll, why they drag my ugly face over here? Well, about 20 years ago, I was a finance professor. I have a PhD in finance with a specialty in real estate. Been working on and appraising real estate since, well, I was that tall, I guess. And the firm that I now head up was looking for someone to come in and potentially be the new CEO. And they gave me a call. I was living in Columbia, South Carolina at the time. And they said, would you like to move to Seattle, Washington? And I said, no. And then they said, well, would you like to visit Seattle, Washington? And I said, well, okay. And the rest of it was just us writing numbers on a piece of paper and passing it across the table. So here I am, been there for 18 years now. Shortly after I moved there, the then CEO of the firm, a fellow named Bill Mundy, who's a highly respected retired real estate appraiser now. He's now retired, but at the time, extraordinarily well respected in the real estate appraisal industry. Bill Mundy asked me if I would hop in his truck and ride with him one day out to a town called Ellensburg, Washington. If you've ever been to the state of Washington, if you leave Seattle and you go over the mountain and you come back down, about an hour and a half later, you're in Ellensburg. And I have to tell you, Eastern Washington has a great agricultural tradition. So Ellensburg was the place they brought cattle to be gathered in a confined area, not unlike what we're talking about here. And then the cattle would be sold and they'd be loaded on the truck and taken off to wherever they become steaks. And I'm fond of cattle. I'm particularly fond of steaks. I own the best grill Weber makes. And I can't even tell you how many cans of propane. I'll be using it this weekend. So I love farms. I grew up on a farm. My sister's much older than me, as you can tell. She graduated in 1952. I, on the other hand, am only 27 years old. But I grew up on a farm. We raised chickens. And so I also am delightful familiarity with chickens. I had an omelet for breakfast this morning. But Bill Mundy wanted me to come see this cattle feedlot. And he wanted my opinion as a PhD financial economist on what to do with it. Now, I want to pause for a moment and tell you a different story so I can come back to that one. How many of you remember or have read about Harry Truman? Remember Harry Truman? Yeah, I remember Harry Truman. Harry Truman every morning liked to go walk around the White House grounds. And it was informal back in those days, so the press would walk along with him. Well, he saw a bare spot in the dirt, and he turned to his aide and he said, "Tell the yard man to put some manure on this bare spot." Well, his daughter was walking, and she just winced, because back in those days, manure was not a proper word. And later he sees another bare spot and turns to his aide and says, "I told you, get the groundsman to put some manure on these spots." Well, she goes back into the White House to her mother, and she says, "Mom, you have got to quit, Dad. You got to get Dad to quit using the word manure in front of the press." Well, Ms. Truman just busted out laughing, and she said, "Honey, you don't know how long it took me to get him to say manure." So the Shaake, S-H-A-A-K-E, Shaake feedlot in Ellensburg, Washington, was a big pile of manure. And the manure was leaching into the Yakima River, which was right next to it. What do you think happens when manure leaches into groundwater, drinking water? Well, it took about an hour and a half for the EPA to shut it down. And now the city of Ellensburg does not have a feedlot. What they have is a big pile of manure sitting next to I-90 at the entrance to the city of Ellensburg. So they call me in 18 years ago and asked me, what can we do to reposition this property? What can we do to remediate and reposition and do something with this property that will be economically viable and useful and helpful to the citizens of Ellensburg, Washington? And I said, and by the way, I was right. What do you think I said? Nothing. There's not a doggone thing, except I didn't use the word doggone. There's not a doggone thing you can do with this. And I drove through Ellensburg just the other day, and it's still there. And they still haven't fixed it. You see, this is about manure. Now, I'm a real estate appraiser, and I specialize to a certain extent in the impact of bad things on good property. In fact, I have a friend, professor in Cleveland named Roby Simons, who wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good Property. And I would recommend the book to you, particularly chapter 10, which is brilliant. I know, I wrote it. But the point is, we do a lot of contaminated property matters. Our firm worked on the Exxon Valdez oil spill. We worked on Hurricane Katrina. We worked on the BP oil spill. we worked on underground contamination problems, airborne contamination problems, riverborne contamination problems, bug-borne contamination problems. And I promise you, if space aliens ever land in the United States and screw something up, they'll call my firm. We consulted to the Japan Real Estate Institute on how to value property after the Fukushima meltdown. I have recently been to New Zealand, to Holland, Canada, a very delightful country, by the way. And we've recently been contacted, believe it or not, by some authorities in the Mideast about contamination problems in Iraq. With all the other problems they have contamination problems too. So after the Shockey feedlot problem, I became really, really interested in the impact of animal feeding operations. And by the way, it's not feed, it's what the animal does to the feed. Animal feeding operations on surrounding property values. So I wrote a journal article for the Appraisal Journal, which is the authoritative official journal of the Appraisal Institute. Let's see here. You're probably not going to be able to read this, but don't worry about it. It's mostly for my benefit. So in 2001, I wrote an article for the Appraisal Journal that summarized everything we knew about the impact of these feedlots on property values. It became widely disseminated. Real estate appraisers all over the country started using this to determine the impact on value of these feedlots. Well, people would call me up and they'd say, I'd like a copy of the article. Really? You have one, that's fine. I'll send it to you. Why do you want it? Well, I've got this thing over here. I've got this thing over there. I got news articles here. We've got this case we're applying to get our taxes reduced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd write all this stuff down. And then in 2015, so I started making notes about these other cases around the country. And at the end of the day, I had pages and pages of additional problems that I didn't know about in 2000. So I wrote a second journal article. It's a companion piece that was also published in the Appraisal Journal in 2015. As I was preparing that 2015 article, I took my notes and was invited to the American Real Estate Society annual meetings on the Big Island and made a presentation there to all the top real estate scholars in the country. That's a group of appraisal and real estate professors. So, feedlots. They're sometimes called animal operations. They're sometimes called animal feeding operations. They're sometimes called concentrated animal feeding operations. The common theme is that it's a small place where too many animals are brought at the same time to be fed and offal coming off on the ground. What's the big deal? Why do we care? I mean, seriously. Here I am living in my house and somebody puts a feedlot across the road. What's the big deal? Well, a couple things. First number, it's not the animals, but it's what they give off, subsequent impacts on the environment, and the value to nearby properties. You see, if I own a house and somebody puts a feedlot across the road, and I try to sell the house, does anybody in the room believe that I'm going to sell it for what it was worth before the feedlot was put there? Well, let me ask you another question while we're going here, because I like question and answer. I used to be a college professor, remember? If you want to buy a house, or rent a house, or live in a house, or have your kids go play in a house. But let's focus on buy for a minute. You want to buy a house. And you've got a choice of two houses. They're identical. They both have the same view, the same number of bedrooms, the same number of bathrooms, the same square footage. They got everything you want, except one of them's across the road from a feed lot, and one of them's not. Which one are you going to buy? Okay. Now, I want you to imagine that you're in the market to buy a car. And this is actually how we go about it. You go to the car lot and you're looking at a brand new minivan. How much somebody give me a number. How much does a brand new minivan cost? Anybody? $25,000. A brand new minivan, $25,000. It's just the one you want. And you say, well, okay, I'll buy this. And then you look across the lot, and there's an identical minivan. Identical. Except when it was being taken off the truck, they dropped it, and it's got a dent in one side. Brand new minivan, 4 miles on the odometer, got a dent in one side. And you say, well, what are you going to do with that one? They say, well, we'll unload it. Well, how much you want for it? Oh, how about $19,000? And you go, it's got a dent in the side, give you $16,500, sold. So if you have this house across the road from the feedlot, am I preaching to the choir here? Is everybody kind of in agreement with this? If you've got this house across the road from the feedlot, people would rather buy the house that's not across the road from the feedlot. So you're going to have to knock the price down. They're going to have to knock the price down. Then you have to knock the price down. And then finally, you're going to get a price where somebody's going to come along and they'll say, okay, I'll buy the house. Now, there is some argument that there are examples, and you can always find one, where people go in and pay full fair market value for houses across the road from a feedlot. You can find examples of everything. Approximately 15% of the American people believe Elvis is still alive and working at a Texaco station in Wilmington, North Carolina. So you can find examples where somebody will come in and buy a house across the road from a feedlot at full fair market value. But guess what? It doesn't usually happen that way. So if you've got a lot of houses that are in this marketplace that's being affected by a feedlot, and I'll tell you in a minute what affected means. They're being affected by the feedlot. And they all go on the market. One of them might sell. And a bunch of them won't sell at all. And the few of them that do sell will sell at a drastically reduced price. And that's true with all forms of what appraisers, and I'm going to use a fancy term here, what appraisers call negative externalities. A negative externality is something that is outside of your property but detracts from the value of it. And contamination is like that. Or if somebody put a toxic waste dump across the road. Or that you found out you were living next door to a meth lab. Or what have you. All of these things cause a diminution in value. I'm going to walk through some slides here that were prepared well in advance of tonight because I didn't know how much you were going to be told before I got up here. Livestock give off 130 times of the total manure of humans in the United States. Very important point. A typical 1,000-pound cow is going to give off somewhere between 75 and 95 pounds of manure a day. So if you have a feedlot with 2,000 cows, it's going to be depositing something like 150 tons of manure into the environment every day. 150 tons on Tuesday. You wake up Wednesday morning, another 150 tons there, whether you wanted it or not. And what are you going to do with this manure? I'm seriously, what are y'all going to do with it? I don't know. I mean, in Ellensburg, Washington, that was a real problem. Now, if it was just manure, that'd be bad enough. But again, just like the feed goes through the cow, and it's the stuff that comes out of the cow that troubles us. It's the stuff that comes out of the manure that troubles us. And I'll just list 3 things. There are a lot more. Physical scientists will tell you about a lot more. I'm just going to list 3. Number 1 is bugs. In this case, biting flies. Lots of flies. In another case in Washington State, not the Shockey case, but another case in Washington State, you may know that for a long time, the state of Washington's been famous for apples. So you go in some parts of Washington State, you got apple orchards all over the place. Well, upwind from some of these apple orchards, somebody put a feedlot. And the flies from the feedlot had manure on their feet. And they flew to the apple orchard. And they landed on the apples. And they stained the apples. And the apples became worthless. Because nobody wants to buy a manure-stained apple. Go down to the grocery store. Safeway's right down the road. They do not have a bin called manure-stained apples, 50% off. If they tried it, maybe, I don't know. Number 1, you got bugs. In this case, I understand it's going to be biting flies. Number 2, you have dust, because dust blows off of the manure. And what does the dust carry? It's called pathogens, poisonous stuff. In the case of cattle, these may be hormones, they may be antibiotics, they may be whatever diseases that the animals had. I have a case that I'm working on right now in Colorado, which is downwind from a chicken plant. These chickens give off dust. The dust is being carried downwind to a horse farm. A veterinarian has found measurable amounts of poison in the horse's nostrils from the dust coming off of the chicken guano. Number 3 is odors. Oh, let's just ignore everything else and talk about that warm morning scent of a cup of coffee and some cattle manure. We get to sit out on the deck. I had a great breakfast this morning. I mentioned I had an omelet. My wife and I are sitting there and we're watching the birds, and I'm having a great cup of coffee. And wouldn't it have been just so much better if there'd been some nice manure smells coming in? That would have just made my day. Unfortunately for me, all I could smell was the ocean surf. But that will all change if this thing goes in, right? Y'all will get that added benefit of your morning coffee along with the perfume. Those are 3. There are plenty more. I know that there are going to be people who are going to be talking with you about pollution of the aquifer, about the fact that they apparently have uncovered that the groundwater is very shallow there. This is in touch with the drinking water aquifer that supplies all the wells in this part of the island. Let's don't even talk about that, okay? So let's go see what other slides I wrote here. Nitrogen and phosphorus, organic material, solids, spilled feed, and interestingly enough, bits of corpses. That gets contained in the air that flows. Pathogens, trace elements like arsenic, antibiotics, pesticides, and hormones. Phosphorus pentoxide is a powerful irritant and corrosive. It reacts violently with water and sucks the oxygen out of water. So if you have water and the water has fish in it, and the potassium oxide from the manure comes in contact with a fish-bearing stream, you'll have ex-fish on your hands, past due fish. Spills from CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operation, have killed fish in several states, correlated with excessive levels of phosphorus. Air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, insect and insect pathogen vectors, groundwater and surface water contamination, other pathogens and vectors for those pathogens. In 2006, the FDA released a press release about E. coli bacteria, 199 cases. 31 cases of uremic syndrome, 102 hospitalizations. Fortunately enough, only 3 people died. Tied to a fresh spinach farm, and then I skipped past, but it was tied to a fresh spinach farm. All of this E. coli came from bagged spinach that people had bought at the grocery store. And they finally traced it back to a runoff from a cattle operation nearby. But like I said, only 3 people died. I understand that this thing is going to employ 4 people, right? But 4 on the island of Kauai. It's going to employ 4 on the island of Kauai. I don't mean to dabble in dark humor, but that one spill killed off 75% of the people who are going to work at this thing. And if I sound like I'm dabbling in dark humor, I am trying to get a point across. From a real estate valuation perspective, that's what I am. I'm a real estate appraiser. These are serious issues, and these are issues that have to be taken into account when people are making real estate decisions in this neighborhood. How am I for time? Anybody know? Oh, I have a watch. Kids gave it to me. Works just fine. I'm skipping around a little bit because I had planned at the end of this talk to talk about economic impacts. I'm talking about property valuation right now. But I will, this slide is probably in the wrong place. A recent study looked at 1,106 communities, some with traditional farming and some with these factory farms. They found that economic growth rates in the communities with traditional farms were 55% higher than communities with the factory farms. Stick a pin in that. We're going to come back to it in a minute. Why? A lot of reasons. Number one, conventional farmers buy more or all of their supplies locally. They employ locally. They don't have people over on other islands working for them. They have them all here. They go down, to the Ace Hardware place if they need to buy a shovel. They go down to the local feed and seed store if they want to buy a 50-pound bag of feed. The larger factory farms negotiate very large national contracts. If I had a farm with 2,000 head of cattle, you can believe I'd be negotiating large national contracts to have my feed shipped in here, not by the 55-pound bag load. Kim and Goldsmith, in a 2008 article, examined 2,155 homes within 3 miles of an animal operation using what's called spatial hedonics. I don't want to bore you with methodology, but we appraisers are relying more and more on mapping, sometimes called geographic information systems. Spatial hedonics allows us to take into account the lay of the land, the winds, the other prevailing geographic forces. Downwind properties are going to be affected more than upwind properties. Properties that can see the facility are going to be affected more than properties that can't see it. Within 3 miles, the average impact, that's the average impact, was negative 18%, and within 1 mile, the average impact was 23%. Now, I say that because I took a look at some data today. Curtis, your local MAI appraiser here, developed some data that I had a chance to take a look at today. The aggregate property values in this area that will be affected by this are something on the order of $1 billion. Am I about right? So according to the county tax collector, the aggregate property values are about $1 billion in the area that will be affected by this. So knock 25% off of that. Somewhere between 20 and 50% is the number you're going to knock off. And that comes straight out of the tax base. Every one of those people ought to go to the county and say, look, this thing gets built across the road from me, or a mile away, 2 miles away, 3 miles away. I want my property taxes reduced. Now you're saying, okay, that affects these people, but I live up in Princeville. That doesn't affect me, right? Because when everybody here cuts their taxes, the county's just going to cut its budget, right? Of course not. Somebody else is going to have to pick up slack. So you could live at the other side of the island, and this thing is going to have an economic impact on you. Kuth and Keeney in a 2012 article noted that an animal operation has the same impact on property values as an industrial waste site, a solid waste site, or a septic waste facility. Also, higher property values in residences are more severely impacted. 4 different articles that I cited that talked about the impact of airborne particulates on property values. An Iowa State study. Iowa State is, you went to Iowa State. Is that a farm-friendly? I mean, you don't get more farm-friendly than Iowa State. If you don't believe me, go there. They give you a tractor the day you enroll. It is, therefore, also concluded that CAFO air emissions may constitute a public health hazard. Palmquist in North Carolina looked at impacts out to 2 miles. Paget and Johnson in 1996 found that homes within a half a mile decreased in value 40%, within 1 mile 30%, 1.5 miles 20%, 2 miles 10%. Other studies have found that properties close to, adjacent to the animal feeding operation can be impacted as high as 88%. Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the University of Minnesota. Again, if you've never been to Minnesota, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a more farm-friendly place in America. Statistically significant impacts, they looked at 292 sales in 2 counties from the 1990s and found statistically significant impacts on property values. Hamed and the University of Missouri studied 99 rural non-farm transactions. Twitmeyer, this is a case in Wichita, Kansas. The jury awarded $15,000 in nuisance because of a nearby animal operation. Not just a reduction in property values, they also gave the property owner $15,000. Pasco, Washington, that's the farm that I told you about with the apples. We found a 50% diminution in value on this family farm as a result of the airborne pathogens. Glenhaven Farm in Ontario, the farm was downwind from a 3,000 hog factory. Local real estate agents suggested that the property had dropped in value by $40,000 Canadian. Lake Huron, Canadian health officials declared 40 kilometers of beaches unsafe because of E. coli emitted from a nearby CAFO. Lab tests showed that the E. coli in the beach Y'all know what a beach looks like here, right? Okay, just want to make sure. E. coli in the beach exceeded water quality standards by 41,000%. Central Industries. I love this one. This is a great story. Central Mississippi. Central Industries. You can't throw a rock in Mississippi and not hit a farmer. And as you can guess from my accent, I grew up in the South. So I like Central Mississippi. They had a chicken processing plant there. The chicken processing plant, y'all have all gone to the store, well, most of you gone to the store and bought a package of chicken that's shrink wrapped. You know what one looks like? This chicken processing plant had these pits that was filled with everything that comes off of a chicken that doesn't go in that shrink wrap package. Now, it rains in Mississippi. Y'all know what rain looks like here, right? I don't want it. Rain went into these holding ponds, holding tanks. They're going to build 2 of these holding tanks in this facility, I understand. Rain went in the holding tanks, overflowed the size of the holding tanks, went into the creek next to the plant. I went down there and spent several days and went on one farm about 5 miles away. And the farmer there showed me where he had found chicken parts hanging from the tree next to the creek that ran through his property. We found measurable impacts on property values as far as 11 and a half miles away. The EPA stepped in, convicted half dozen or so of the plant managers of gross violations, sent 2 of them to prison, fined the rest of them millions of dollars. Plant's still there. They're still doing it. I'm a private pilot, so I happened to be in Mississippi a couple of years ago, and I was flying from one side of Mississippi to the other in an air-conditioned airplane. And I happened to remember that I was going to be flying over the top of this plane. So when I got over the top of the plant, not quite a mile up, I decided to circle, do some airborne version of some donuts in the air so I could lean out the window and take some aerial pictures of the thing. Young lady in the airplane with me almost lost her lunch because of the smell emanating from this thing a mile up in an air-conditioned airplane. Plant was fined $14 million. They're still in operation. Livingston versus Jefferson, Nebraska Board of Equalization. House was built 3/4 of a mile from a 5,200 sow manure spray field, 30% diminution in value. They determined that the house had devalued 30%, so they reduced the man's property taxes 30%. This particular case is very interesting to me because the property owner who sued to get his taxes reduced was also the man who owned the factory farm. He built it and then admitted it devalues property and went and got his own property devalued by 30%. Who am I to disagree with the man? Cravens County, North Carolina. GIS model determined that a home a mile from a 5,000 animal swine facility will have a statistically significant diminution in value. Iowa State again, let's see here, Michigan odor study. For every 1,000 animals, there was a drop in selling price of $430. So here is a list of property tax reductions that appears in one of the articles that I wrote. Can't remember which one. 30%, 35%, 20%, 30%, 35%, 10%, 18%, all around the country. And when you look in these areas, these are not farm unfriendly areas. These are farm-friendly places. Grundy County, Missouri, just from the name of that. I've never been to Grundy County, Missouri. I'm betting they're farmers there. Mecosta County, Michigan, Midland County, Michigan, DeWitt County, Illinois, McLean County, Illinois, DeKalb, Alabama, Minnesota, Iowa, Maryland, Muhlenberg, Kentucky. These are places where the local tax authorities have recognized that they have a problem. Here are court cases that have been settled, not just property tax reductions, but actual cases where the owners of the feedlot were sued by the surrounding property owners and won. Nebraska, $375,000. I'm just skipping a few. Missouri, $5.2 million. The Buckley Egg Farm case, which has gone back and forth to the Supreme Court a couple of times there, $19 million. Blass versus Iowa Select Farms, $33 million. Bear versus Buckley Egg Farm, $50 million court case. $100,000 Sierra Club versus Whitaker, $4.5 million. Turner versus Premium Standard Farms. And then there was an unreported case. The respondent wasn't reported, $27,000 in Illinois. So I've had an opportunity to look at economic impact studies from around the country for a lot of different projects. I've contributed to economic impact studies. When I was teaching real estate finance at the University of South Carolina, yes, you can cut those on as far as I'm concerned, I was regularly called in by the State Budget Control Board of the State Senate to assist with state-sponsored economic impact studies. I wrote the 1996 report of the state of South Carolina to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development on the state of housing in the state of South Carolina. I know what an economic impact study looks like. I've been through some of the documentation that's been submitted in this case. I've yet to see anything that looks like an economic impact study. I want to repeat that. I've yet to see anything that looks like, smells like, tastes like, feels like an economic impact study. It's not just the impact on property values, it's the impact on jobs, it's the impact on the local economy. How much will local property tax collections be affected? We'll know they'll go down. I mean, we know that. There's no doubt about that. Question is just how much. Now, you've got tourism in this island. Some people like it, some people don't. I'm a tourist here right now. I hope every tourist who comes to the island is respectful of the wonderful place that we're visiting. Not all of us are, and I apologize for that. Nonetheless, tourism does provide some employment in this area. My best estimate that I've been informed of is that there are about 2,200 people employed in tourism-related jobs in the affected area. Like it or not, tourism brings hundreds of millions of dollars into this island every year. You might agree with it, you might disagree with it, but a lot of good things happen because of those hundreds of millions of dollars, much of which apparently was charged on my wife's Visa card this afternoon. So how many of those 2,200 people are going to be laid off? Some. I mean, if you own a hotel or a rental house or a tourist house or something like that that's downwind, that has bugs, has biting flies, has that wonderful coffee aroma every morning. That's what we're going to call it now, coffee aroma. You're going to have a problem. And people are going to lose their jobs. Now, what happens to those people? Well, they go to the county and they say, hey, give me some money. I got to go on unemployment or welfare. I need some food stamps or help with my medical bills or something because I don't have a job. But remember, the county, it's lowering property taxes because of these other people who are complaining about their property values going down. So where is that addressed? That has to be addressed in some of this. I don't see it. I mentioned to you that local community farms, traditional farms, spend their money locally. Large factory operations, it's been shown. I'm not just talking out of the top of my head. There have been scientific studies done by scholars in the field at universities that are traditionally, farm-friendly universities that have found consistently negative local economic impacts from these things. None of that's been addressed. Now, if you are honest and you address those things, you then talk about how you're going to mitigate them. Where I do a lot of real estate projects. I work on a lot of real estate projects, consult on a lot of real estate projects. And there's something called mitigation. If I'm going to do this that's going to harm people, I've got to do this other thing to clean them up. I saw a factory farm in North Carolina do something that I thought was actually pretty smart. Now, I'm from the Carolinas, so I can tell you about North Carolina. You can buy real estate there for what you guys have got in your pockets right now. If we took up a collection of just the loose change in your pockets, I could probably buy a nice farm in North Carolina. It's a place with cheap dirt. So this factory farm went into North Carolina, and they found a place where they were going to build a hog plant, a hog farm. And then they knocked on all the doors all the way around. And they said, we're putting in a hog plant. We're going to manufacture pigs. We're going to take little pigs and we turn them into big pigs. It's a manufacturing process. And we're going to have pig manure, and you're not going to like it. So I have my checkbook here, and I'd like to buy your farm. And all these people said, yeah, fine. So they all sold their farms at top dollar, which in North Carolina is not very much. So you put these things in a place where you can buy up the local real estate cheap. I saw a chicken processing plant in Alabama do identically the same thing. They were going to have to get rid of the manure. So what did they do? They bought up the fields around them. And then they sprayed it in these Bermuda fields. That got rid of it. But you buy up, the real estate that you're going to affect. But you can't do that here. This is a problem here because, number one, people already live in this real estate. Number two, you're going to be affecting things for miles downwind. And number three, this plant is going to be affecting the ecology because you've got this groundwater table problem. So whomever might be drinking out of those drinking water wells that's tied into that aquifer, you all have a problem too. You all may very well have a diminution value. You may be many miles from this thing. And if you're tied into that aquifer, you may be calling me up on the phone. Please do. I enjoy coming to Kauai. At the beginning of most of my talks, I tell people that I'm an old, frustrated college professor. I miss the classroom. I try to go back and lecture on campuses on a regular basis. And I always say I like a dialogue. So if you have questions, stop me anywhere in the talk and just go ahead and ask the question. I apologize, I forgot to do that. So with your permission, I'm going to start over. We've got a few minutes here. And I do appreciate your hospitality. It's been great. But who's among you have questions? May I? Yes, sir. You want the?
No, I don't need it. In locating animal feed operations, dairy farms, in this 3 to 5 mile sort of proximity to resort properties, vacation rentals, condominiums, hotels, and all this, would you think that the impact would be much greater than what it would be by putting a hog plant in the middle of a small?
Well, there are two parts to that question. I want to be very careful about it. I know it has been characterized as a dairy farm, but I grew up on farms. It doesn't look anything like a farm I grew up on. This is a manufacturing facility. So the question is, would this manufacturing facility be different if it was located somewhere else? Is the impact greater? Well, like I said, in North Carolina, you buy a lot of houses for $50,000 in rural North Carolina. You can't buy many houses for $50,000 a year. I'm sorry about that. You know, I live in King County, Washington. I'll match you dollar for dollar on housing problems. I'm on a list I don't like being on, which is one of the top property taxpayers in rural King County. But the fact is, locating something like that here, where a 50% diminution in a $500,000 house is a lot bigger number than a 50% diminution in a $50,000 house, when the impact on the local property tax base here is going to be much bigger than it would be in rural North Carolina. As an economist, doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't. It's the wrong thing in the wrong place. Yes, ma'am.
Health, is that part of your focus in this work?
Well, I'm not a physician. I'm not a toxicologist, epidemiologist. I am married to a woman with a master's in public health who used to be a hospital executive, so I am on a daily basis reminded all of my bad habits. The steak I eat, for example, I should be steel-cut oatmeal for dinner. But having said that, as an appraiser, I get called in on a lot of situations where there are health impacts, where there are toxicological, epidemiological impacts, where there are pollutants that affect people in a variety of different ways. I was in Columbus, Mississippi, looking at a creosote plant, and I went down a street that had 7 houses on it, and 6 of them had children with cancer. Now, I'm not a physician, but that sounded like a really bad roll of the dice. And so I can't specifically opine about the medical problems, but I can tell you that when we see all of these pathogens, when I, as a real estate appraiser, get called into these things, and sorry about the microphone, I'm not a rock star, so I don't do microphones real well. But when I get called into these cases and I see, these kinds of situations, this is, as one study showed, no different from an industrial toxic waste dump. There's a lady right here. Yes, ma'am. I've met with 3 council members. I felt like it was well received. I understand that I'm supposed to meet with the mayor tomorrow. But as I say, I met with 3 council members, and I thought they were very interested in what I had to say, and most importantly, they asked interesting questions. And that was, in my mind, the most telling. Yes, sir.
Thank you. North Carolina.
Yes.
There was one CAFO that was on the outskirts of it, was a poor black community. They didn't even bother trying to buy up the houses. I'm talking about the effects of caustic ammonium burns on membranes. They had major health problems because the ammonium from the pigs, in that case, although you get it from the cattle, it interacts with the soil and the water, and you get ammonium. One as a deposit on the grass, but then you get the aerosolized ammonium that can drift. Here on this area, we have Kona winds 2 to 3 times a year, where convective pressure puts a layer over this south area. We get the Maha winds, and the drift is much more intensified. As a former firefighter, I learned about convective.
Let me key off of the very first sentence, and all of that's great stuff, and all of it's real and right. But there was a sentence there that caused me to think about something. It's a term called environmental justice. And I look out around the room. Don't take this the wrong way, but I see a room full of pretty well-fed people. Nobody as well-fed as I am. But, you know, y'all all look like you got bank accounts. Now, why am I saying that? Because what if you all just disappeared? What if somehow or another, economically, you're all just going to pack up and leave? There is a strong argument that a lot of these things will really trample the rights of people who don't have voice. People at the tail end of the economic spectrum who can't come to a meeting like this because they're bussing tables at the Hyatt right now. Who can't come to a meeting like this because they're exhausted from digging holes in the ground all day or doing stuff that makes you sweat for a living. I need one of those jobs. I'm sweating right now. But the fact is there is a very powerful argument that you folks have a voice and you have an opportunity to contribute to the voice. I'm not here to, raise money. I mean, there are other people who are going to do that. But you have the power to be able to speak and have your voices heard. But there are people who don't have the power to speak and don't have their voices heard. And if you folks weren't here, I can promise you their rights would not be represented. And that's the environmental justice argument, which permeates a lot of these situations. More questions? Yes, ma'am, right here, and then here, and then here. Yes, ma'am, right here.
We have the pleasure of living near Molowa'a, and it's where the last dairy was shut down here, the last active dairy. And about, I don't even remember if it was 10 or 20 years ago, we could not go outside without long pants and socks. And I don't want to point a finger at you, but if you take a look around at this room, most people do not have on long pants and socks. And it was the biting flies. You can sort of get used to the smell, but you could not be out.
Yeah. Is everybody hearing her? She's talking about the biting flies. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I was talking about the biting flies around the Molowa'a dairy.
Yeah.
That was in operation until about 10 or 20 years ago. I honestly don't remember. But you could not be outside. You had to wear long pants and shoes and socks. And we're farmers.
Could I ask you a question? Do you
Sure.
remember how many head of cows that dairy had?
Well, they were in the diminishing, they were winding down. So they never had more than 1,200.
Never had more than 1,200.
And the reason they were shut down is because they polluted the waters, the receiving waters of the ocean. But when they were in full operation in the 60s, I think they were up to 1,200. But because they never kept them all at Molowa'a, they moved them between Ka'aka'aniu and all around. And we could totally tell where the cows were. And they also had a bizarre cattle gate at night that we heard all night long, and the cows would push their nose, and so it was audio impacts too. So it was never reflected on property taxes or anything else, but the inability to be outside ever. It was more in the daytime than the night, but they're carrion flies.
You want to get an audio impact. You get 2,000 head of cattle and let a tree get hit by lightning nearby. You can have some audio impacts. Yes, ma'am. Was it over here? Someone? Yes, ma'am. They're passing a microphone to you right now. Oh, I think this lady right here was next. I'm sorry. And then over here, and then back to you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, the cases that you talked about resulted in criminal action and in fines, and occasionally you mentioned shutting down. You didn't mention anything about remediation of whatever harm was caused.
Yeah, I
Can you
haven't
talk
seen
about
much of
that
that. No, I put in my 2015 article some discussion of mediation We've not seen a whole lot of evidence of remediation. What we have seen is they pay the fine, they keep on going. Or the local county has to reduce property taxes, but the polluter just keeps on going. The EPA is, I think, becoming more serious about fines and Clean Water Act violations, but as far as making the community whole again, other than lawsuits, I'm not aware of any. Can we get the microphone? I think there was a lady over here who's been waiting for a few minutes, and then over here, and then back to you. Yes, ma'am.
Just wanted to say when they were going to do another garbage dump in Kalaheo,
Yes.
and right in the middle of the coffee fields, the coffee people and the community said no. And then they got more serious, the county, about taking care of putting recycling and getting more into that. So they put it on the community and expanded the Kekaha landfill. But yeah, so it has been done before.
Yes, ma'am.
They said no.
Got it. I think, yes, this lady back here, I think she's been patiently waiting.
Well, this is your field of expertise, but I just want to bring it to our awareness that the property values here in the Poipu area especially are particularly inflated, even by Hawaii standards. And that's because of our tourism and our wonderful beaches and all the hotels that have taken advantage of this environment. So I think that if you were estimating the drop in values if this dairy comes in, that you're going to see a much more significant, I just guessing from practical, thought it'd be more like 60 to 70%, because the values are so high, and because, like you said, who's going to buy it? Who's going to come in when there's no longer the recreational facilities that this whole property value is based on? If people cannot be outside with the flies and the ocean is polluted, there's no draw to this area.
Let me give you one example, and I can't disagree with what you just said, but let me give you an interesting example from King County, Washington, where I live. Seattle is in King County, Washington, and East King County, Washington has some pricey homes, no question about it. During the recent recession, 2008, 9, 10, the meltdown where places like Las Vegas, you couldn't give a house away, King County, Washington stayed pretty solid. I mean, we've got Microsoft, we've got Boeing, we've got Peterbilt trucks, we've got the shipping port, we've got Costco, Amazon.com, and I have one son who works for Amazon and another for Microsoft. I'm a lucky dad. But because the financing went away, because you couldn't borrow money for upscale homes, the upscale market stopped. The market for homes above $1 million just stopped in King County because you couldn't finance these things. So yeah, when you have something that has a differential economic impact, it can, the market for some homes can really get hit severely. There was somebody, yes, right here. Thank you, ma'am.
Your stories and examples are horrifying, and I think what everybody in this room and the other hundreds or thousands of people in the area really want is how to prevent the dairy from coming here in the first place so that we don't have to face any of these horrors. You mentioned that you have not seen an economic survey, economic impact study.
I've seen things that purport to be economic impact studies. It doesn't look like one. It doesn't have anything like the detail or the information that a college freshman would put in an economic impact study.
So
Yes, ma'am.
is it fair then to say that, in your opinion, our having a well-done economic impact study would enhance our position with whom? With the county government, with the state, with Hawaii dairy farms? How could we utilize that information as an adjunct to preventing the dairy from coming in?
It's the dairy who have the job of producing, and I call it a dairy, son of a gun. I've been reading the stuff. It's the feedlot's job to produce an economic impact study. They are supposed to produce a study for the county and for anybody else who's in the permitting process that describes in detail what the impact what the economic impact of this thing's going to be. It's not y'all's job to produce one. It's their job to produce one. And I've seen the EIS, and there's nothing in there that resembles an economic impact study.
Dr. Kilpatrick, let's share with the audience, though, that we have retained this gentleman, and he is going to be preparing a very cogent response to the draft EIS. So he will be telling the state what the deficiencies are, and what they filed does not constitute an economic study. And he's going to lay that out for them.
I think you got one more question over here, and then I'm gonna let it get passed on to other people.
Thank you. There's an item that we haven't discussed that is a boon in our favor. Our attorney, Charlie Tebbett, our attorney, Charlie Tebbett, won a landmark case against the state of Washington, which determines that you don't have to wait for the damage to occur. If you can prove that the damage is likely to occur, then you can get an injunction before it begins. That's brand new. The other thing he managed was to classify manure as solid waste. The EIS is trying to avoid any solid waste categorization by saying they're going to take it as much as they're going to take some of it, and they're going to aerosolize it and spray it over the fields. And of course, that's going to be drift too.
I'm going to pass the baton, if you will. You want me to take any more questions? I think it's about time for...
I have a question. I'm curious. If this project fails, is that land going to be reopened for rezoning?
Sir, I wish I could tell you. Perhaps one of these other folks can be of...
No, it's designated important agricultural lands, and the whole hoopla is in that they do have a clause where they can take so much out a year. 10%. 10% a year. It's just that they have a clause. They can take 10% out of the important land designation a year, but it's got to go to, the rest of it has got to go to agriculture. Of course, it's a question, is a factory farm agriculture or is growing crops agriculture, and which is the highest and best designation?
Thank you. And with that in mind, I'm going to pass the baton here.